This program is brought to you by realestate.com.au. See more of every property on the realestate.com.au app.
It's great to have your company here on Business Now. Let's take you around the country and look at the health of our housing markets nationally. There were 1,946 auctions, a clearance rate, you can see here, just a tick over 65%. In Sydney, the results seem to slip away again. There were 710 auctions, but just 57.5% of those were sold. I wonder whether there's any overhang with those unsold properties. We'll talk to Angus more about that shortly. Melbourne also improving, 844 auctions, more than 74% of those were sold. Brisbane had 72 auctions, almost 64% were successful. Adelaide remains buoyant, 54 auctions, almost 76% of those successful under the hammer. In Canberra, 50 auctions and 78% were sold. Well, Angus Moore is the senior economist with the REA Group and joins me now. Angus, thanks for your time as always. We can see the housing markets broadly are strong, but a real question is whether we simply can't build enough homes quickly enough to keep up with the demand.
Yeah, look, certainly the new homes market and the construction sector more broadly has been a really challenging picture for, I'd say 3 years, but it's probably more like 5 at this point. We've had a lot of challenges in that market. And one of the big ones is it's just taking us a lot longer to build homes than it used to, which means we're just not delivering as many homes as, we want to.
So that being the case, we know the government has built enormous amounts of infrastructure, both state government and the federal government. Many people have talked about them crowding out the employment market, which means that really that construction companies in particular looking to build private housing just haven't been able to find the workers.
Yeah, one of the big challenges that has been facing construction firms over the past really 5 years has been the difficulty sourcing labour. And that comes down to a couple of things. As you say, one, we've had a lot of big state government infrastructure projects going on. And that means that we've seen an enormous surging in employment in those sort of heavy and civil construction industries. And to some extent, that's going to have come at the cost of employment in, residential and, to some extent, commercial construction. Now, obviously, those two things aren't perfectly substitutable. As I like to joke, there's not a lot of tunnels built in kitchens and not a lot of cabinetry built in the WestConnex project, but there is still some substitutability between the sort of labour that works on those projects. And so it has, to some extent, crowded it out. The good news is, we are starting to see those projects wind down, and that means some of that labour is coming available, and we are starting to see a bit of a pickup in residential construction employment.
OK, then the question is about the lag. I mentioned that there were not as many Sydney auctions being successful right now. Does that mean there is an overhang of unsold properties that sits on the markets for longer, waiting for buyers?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, we've certainly seen softer auction market conditions across Sydney really throughout much of this year compared to, say, Melbourne in particular. That said, it does look like things have maybe softened off a little bit further over the past few weeks in Sydney. Now, we don't, get particularly timely data. Most of our data is monthly, and auction clearance rates are really the most timely data that we have. So it's probably too soon to say whether we're seeing that show up in how long it's taking homes to sell or whether it's showing up in home prices yet. And certainly in August, it hadn't. Home prices across Sydney were up pretty strongly in August, and that's consistent with what we've seen this year in Sydney. Prices have been growing every month so far. But, there are maybe some signs, particularly as we head into spring where there is more activity, the market is a bit more liquid, a bit deeper, that things might be starting to cool a little bit in Sydney.
OK, just one other thing for you, and that is unemployment numbers come out this Thursday in Australia. Any increase in unemployment puts pressure on housing markets almost immediately. I mean, it's still very strong, the employment market. The question is just where it goes from here.
Yeah, certainly unemployment's very low at the moment. It's not as low as perhaps it was, a couple years ago, but still at, sort of low 4% consistently over the last few months. That's very low relative to historic standards, sort of 50-year lows at the moment. That's obviously one of the things that the RBA is keeping an eye on. It is one of the reasons they haven't been cutting rates faster than what we've seen thus far, though I think it would take a pretty big change in the labour market to really change where the RBA is at. It's very hard to see them cutting at their upcoming meeting, given the monthly inflation data that we've had, and they're very likely to want to wait for the quarterly inflation coming out next month.
I'll tell you what, we'll see those employment numbers on Thursday, and then, of course, the RBA's next interest rate decision, which will be tomorrow fortnight. Angus Moore, always good to chat to you. Many thanks for your time today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, Russ.